Hey there, welcome. Tonight, we're taking an incredibly slow tour of a typical Viking longhouse pantry, because nothing says exciting apocalypse prep like stale bread and questionable dried fish. Before we settle in, let me know in the comments what small, strange thing helps you fall asleep. Now, get comfortable, and let's begin. You step toward the longhouse, the packed earth crunching softly beneath your boots. And the first thing you notice is the door, not grand, not gilded. A modest slab of timber, gray with age, its surface smoothed by generations of hands hauling food in and out. You press your palm to the wood. It is cool and slightly rough, flecked with frost on the outer edge, a whisper that winter is always near, even when it is not. The beam above your head, carved with shallow spirals and tiny notches, supports the low entryway. You duck instinctively as you cross the threshold. The smell changes. The smoky tang of the hearth lingers behind you, replaced by the subtle must of dried herbs, clay, cold ash, and something sour-sweet that you cannot place. You are not even in the pantry proper yet. You are in the tiny in-between, the hinge of the longhouse, where storage begins and everything else dims. The air is thick with quiet here. Your footfall softens on the compacted soil. This pantry has no floorboards, only worn earth, smoothed by foot traffic and slightly grooved in the corners where runoff once crept. A single iron hook juts from the doorpost. Nothing is hanging there now, but you imagine a lantern, a pouch, or maybe an unlucky rabbit waiting to be skinned. You do not linger on that thought. The light inside is barely there. One tiny sliver from a roof vent catches the edge of a beam and paints it pale gold. The rest falls into cool, velvety shadow. To your right, the wall curves inward. The longhouse is not built for show. It swells slightly in the middle, a belly for hoarding what matters: food, tools, flavor, and survival. You run your fingers lightly along the timber wall. It is damp in places, dry in others, lined with faint tool marks, evidence of someone long ago shaping it without imagining. You hear centuries later, poking around like a nosy archaeologist with bedtime issues. Beneath your boots, you feel a subtle dip. It is not your imagination. The threshold sags just slightly. This spot is old, well used, passed through 1,000 times. Historians still argue whether pantry thresholds were intentionally sunken for drainage, or whether the ground simply gave up after years of weight and wet leather trampling through. Either way, you imagine the moment someone decided to patch it with straw, then another, then none at all. To your left, the pantry begins to widen. You squint into the dim and make out the silhouettes of shelves, thick planks resting on wooden pegs driven into the wall at odd intervals. Nothing in this room is perfectly even. Every board has its own idea of straightness. That said, it holds. You wonder how many jars have rested there over the centuries. Salted fish, dried apples, cracked wheat in woven baskets. You can almost hear the creak of something settling under its own weight. The ceiling is low. Not enough to stoop, unless you are absurdly tall, but low enough to make you move slower, more deliberately, as if the room is encouraging you to take your time, as if the pantry itself is saying, everything you need is here, but not in a rush, not like the gods with their flashy mead halls and golden apples. This room is for real food, real life. You take another step. The scent of cedar catches your nose. It comes not from the walls, which are mostly pine and birch, but from a single beam crossing overhead. A replacement, a trophy. No one knows. It smells like warmth in a snowstorm. There are people who say Vikings were too pragmatic for scented woods. Those people have clearly never walked into a pantry at night and been grateful for a smell that reminds them of summer. In the far corner, barely visible, is a tiny stool. 3 legs, short enough to suggest it was not for sitting so much as squatting while sorting root vegetables or scrubbing buckets. You imagine someone sitting there in woolen socks, muttering about the frost getting into the dried peas again. A practical soul, probably missing 3 fingers. A draft slips in through a gap between boards. You feel it wrap around your ankles like a whispering cat. You ignore it. The temperature in here stays cool enough for storing food, not so cold as to freeze, but certainly not warm. Some scholars believe Viking longhouse pantries doubled as curing rooms. Others argue the smokehouse was always separate. The arguments get oddly heated, especially when fermented shark is involved. You move deeper. The light fades further. If you held your hand up, you would barely see the outline. But you are not worried. You are not here for the light. You are here for the quiet, deliberate ritual of opening every jar in your imagination, one by one, slowly. Because every item on these shelves was hard-won, fished, foraged, slaughtered, churned, or brewed, and none of it came from a plastic-wrapped aisle. As you lean against the edge of the first shelf, a tiny puff of dust drifts up. You watch it swirl in the low light, like smoke with nowhere to go. There is a stillness to this room that feels earned. It has held seasons inside its walls. Summers stuffed with berries, winters of scraping at pickled beets with a horn spoon, springs when the shelves were nearly empty, and every creak of the floorboard reminded you to eat slowly. You cannot help but wonder how many people leaned where you now stand, wondering the same thing, wondering whether the smoked lamb would last until thaw, wondering what dried fish tastes like when you run out of herbs, wondering how on earth this pantry never collapsed under the weight of all that quiet desperation. And you are just at the edge. You shuffle a little further into the pantry, your boots brushing over the fine straw strewn along the ground, left there intentionally to soak up damp and discourage mice. Whether it is effective remains unclear, considering the small gnaw marks on the nearest shelf. The Vikings, like most people who lived long before industrial pest control, fought a losing but determined battle against rodents. If you were lucky, your cat was efficient. If not, your pantry turned into a vermin nightclub after sundown. Brave warrior devoured by heroic rat swarm lacks poetic flair. Directly ahead, the first section of shelving groans quietly under the weight of preservation. Earthenware pots sit in a row, each with a lid fashioned from tightly stretched animal bladder, tied in place with sinew. The air around them is still, but beneath those membranes, slow transformations are underway. Sauerkraut bubbles quietly. Fermented milk thickens into skyr, Iceland's answer to yogurt, though it has more temps and fewer modern Instagram endorsements. You lift the lid of one jar slightly, not spoiled, just powerful, like Viking fashion choices. To your left, a bundle of dried herbs hangs upside down from a rafter beam. You brush your fingers against them gently. Thyme, lovage, angelica. If you are feeling fancy, it releases a faint green scent, sharp and dusty. The Vikings did not have spices in abundance, not unless someone had recently gone pillaging in the east. But herbs were local, familiar, and prized. They added brightness to otherwise repetitive meals, or so we assume. Historians still argue whether herbs were primarily used for flavor or for medicinal purposes. The truth is likely both. When food tastes like boiled despair, a handful of thyme helps the mead go down. A large wooden bowl rests beneath the lowest shelf. Inside it, a heap of dried apples, leathery and darkened by time. You reach in, pluck one, and bite. The texture is chewy, the taste unexpectedly floral. Not sweet like supermarket apple rings, but intense. This is the flavor of fruit stripped to its essence, then forgotten for 4 months behind a barrel. The Vikings dried apples in the late summer, often in smokehouses or near hearths, storing them for winter's leaner days. Whether they tasted like this is speculation, but the effort is unquestionable. Your hand grazes another jar. It is heavier, colder. Inside sloshes a brine as clear as quartz. Pickled onions, perhaps, or garlic, or something more obscure. One theory claims the Vikings occasionally pickled fish livers. Another insists this was a misunderstanding by later chroniclers who mistook fish sauce for an actual thing you would willingly eat. The reality likely lands somewhere between culinary bravery and poor decision-making. You do not lift this lid. Overhead, a string runs the length of the pantry, sagging slightly from years of use. From it dangle smoked sausages, strung together like grotesque pearls. They twist slightly in the faint draft, their skins wrinkled and brown. The scent is unmistakable. Salt, smoke, meat. This was not snack food. This was survival in casing form. Each one is the result of a successful hunt or a successful trade. To your right now, tucked behind a warped plank, is a woven basket. Inside, root vegetables, mostly turnips and carrots, thick and knobbly, their surfaces dulled by a thin film of soil. The Vikings stored root vegetables in baskets padded with straw, often buried partly in the floor or tucked near the coolest corners. Some believed the roots lasted longer if they were not scrubbed clean, less moisture loss, fewer pests. Others just could not be bothered. Scholars still debate whether cleanliness was pragmatic or a sign of desperation. You lean closer. Something catches your attention beneath the shelf. An old pair of sandals, woolen, frayed, likely left there in summer and never retrieved. Or maybe a last-minute offering to Thor, who is said to have a soft spot for wool, as long as it is not itchy. It is probably just a forgotten pair. But imagining the pantry doubling as a shrine is more entertaining. Food and faith, after all, often shared close quarters. In the far corner, opposite the herbs, is a series of tiny clay jars, each no larger than your palm. Inside them, seeds, flax, barley, maybe hemp, carefully stored against rats, rot, and rain. They represent next year's hope, or at least next year's porridge. Vikings did not always plant every seed in spring. They held some back. Insurance in edible form. A gamble wrapped in pottery. You hold one jar and shake it slightly. The seeds rattle like soft rain. A cough of wind creeps in again through the pantry slats. It carries a whisper of something unfamiliar, decay, perhaps, or ancient cheese. It is difficult to tell. Viking cheese was rarely uniform. Some aged beautifully. Others aged into deeply personal experiences. Some fragments of sagas make passing reference to cheese, usually when it goes missing. One might infer it was valuable, or impossible to ignore. You pause by the wall. There is a faint scratch mark near your elbow, a tally, perhaps, or a child's name etched with a dull blade. You trace it slowly, imagining a small hand gripping a knife, carving boredom into history. Children were not spared the chores of winter preparation, stirring butter, turning spit, collecting dropped apples from under icy trees. You wonder if that scratch was a protest or boredom. And all the while, you have only crossed half the room. You move deeper into the pantry, where the scent of smoked fish thickens, mingling with the must of earth-packed floors and the slight sting of mead-soaked barrels. The air grows colder. This part of the room has fewer windows, none, in fact, and what little light there was fades entirely. Your eyes adjust slowly, as if your pupils are politely declining this task. You keep walking, past another row of shelves so aged they bow like old warriors under too many winters. Now you find the fish. They hang in rigid lines, like soldiers who lost their war to a drying rack. Herring, mostly, their skins silvery and dry as parchment. Beside them, slabs of cod, salted until they resemble mineral samples more than food. The Vikings were masters of preservation. Not out of culinary ambition, of course, but because rotting fish tends to lower morale. Salt was currency and lifeline, traded from coastal settlements or produced laboriously by boiling seawater. This briny ballet kept pantries like this one functional long after the fjords froze. And here you are, surrounded by the Viking equivalent of a long-term relationship. High maintenance, occasionally smelly, but critical for survival. There is a small wooden tub near your feet. You lift the lid. Inside, butter. Or something once related to butter, now hardened by time into an almost waxen block. Viking butter was often churned by hand, using a carved wooden dasher and more arm strength than most modern gym routines. It was stored in clay pots or small tubs like this one, and sometimes buried underground to keep it cold. And yes, some of it was intentionally buried for months, maybe even years, as a form of preservation. Historians still argue whether this bog butter was a delicacy, a mistake, or just an early form of culinary hazing. Your fingers trail along the wooden lip of a barrel. Mead sloshes within, a thin, sweet smell clinging to the staves. Mead was the drink of celebration, but also the everyday: honey, water, and time. Plus, if one was lucky, a few herbs or spices. If one was not lucky, the mead had a tang best described as regretful. But it was safer than raw water, and considerably more fun at feasts. The meat makers, often women, were vital to the household economy. A steady hand meant a steady winter. One bad batch, and suddenly it was Thor's will. Instead of user error, you find a barrel of ale nearby, lower alcohol, made for daily drinking. Everyone partook, even children. In a world where clear water could be an invitation to illness, ale was hydration with a small buzz and a long aftertaste of grain. Some varieties included birch sap, heather, or yarrow for flavor and fermentation. You run a finger along the rim, damp, cool, and faintly sticky, not unpleasant, just inevitable. Next to the ale is a small jar, nearly invisible in the shadows. You lift the lid and blink. Mushrooms, dried and leathery, not the fun kind, probably. Vikings gathered a range of mushrooms from nearby forests, many edible, some deeply regrettable. Without modern identification guides, the selection process was trial and error. Sometimes, error won. There is a story in a lesser-known saga about a jarl's feast ruined by ill-chosen fungi. The guests survived, but the singing continued for 3 days straight. Scholars still debate whether this was embellishment or enthusiastic honesty. You brush past a sack. It rustles, shifting under its own weight. Grain, coarse barley, mostly, a staple, used for bread, porridge, ale. It was soaked, ground, boiled, and baked, again and again until something edible happened. Viking bread was dense, unleavened, and often filled with whatever was on hand: seeds, twigs, the occasional pebble, depending on the millstone. The average Viking's dentalware tells the story. Smiles worn down to the root. Bread was survival, not delicacy. You feel the rough edges of a baking stone nearby. Cold, heavy, unused for days. It smells faintly of smoke and ash. You imagine a woman here, kneeling before the hearth, slapping dough onto it in quick, practiced movements. Maybe she is humming or swearing. It is hard to tell with Vikings. To the side, stacked neatly, are wheels of hard cheese, aged, cracked, and banded with cloth. The smell, frankly, challenges your commitment to historical authenticity. Viking cheese came in many forms, most of them dependent on raw milk, rennet, and an environment somewhere between cool and not death. Some was eaten fresh, soft, and tart. The rest was hardened into transportable, edible wheels, traded as valuable goods across the sea. Cheese that survived the voyage was considered a triumph. Cheese that did not was considered a weapon. Next to the cheese, a carved wooden spoon rests in a bowl filled with what looks like ash. You taste it and confirm it is salt, probably mixed with charcoal or ash to stretch the supply. Salt was not mined locally. It was precious, laboriously gathered and hoarded. A full sack was a symbol of prosperity or very efficient raiding. You tuck the spoon back. It was probably hand-carved by someone who hoped future generations would respect their artistry more than you just did. In the corner now, wrapped in hide, is a package. Inside, dried berries, mostly bilberries and crowberries, dark and shriveled. They look like overachieving raisins. These were boiled into gruel, mashed into meat, or simply chewed when hunger demanded. Berries were seasonal gold, harvested quickly and with care. Children often gathered them in woven baskets, rewarded not with coin, but with. You turn slowly, almost ceremoniously, to face the darkened side wall of the pantry, where a rack of hanging meats waits, like a jury of withered judges. Cured sausages, looped and stiff, swing gently when you pass. Beside them, slices of smoked lamb, their surfaces glinting faintly with fat hardened to a translucent sheen. The scent hits you again. Salt, smoke, and something wild underneath, a whisper of forest and fire. Meat preservation in a Viking longhouse was no amateur hour. Without refrigeration, families leaned heavily on smoking, salting, drying, and sometimes fermenting, depending on the season and their willingness to suffer odd textures. The smokehouses out back did most of the heavy lifting. Simple wooden huts, with just enough ventilation to keep the fire alive, but not so much that the meat roasted. It was a slow process, often days, and the results could last for months if kept dry. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly enjoyed this kind of meat or merely endured it. Some suggest these meats were festive foods, brought out for special occasions. Others think they were standard fare, used to pad out meals when fresh meat was scarce. Either way, you get the feeling that chewing a Viking sausage required patience, determination, and perhaps an especially strong jaw. You reach for a length of rope. It is twined around bundles of dried herbs, angelica, thyme, juniper, and a curling mass of what might be nettle. Angelica, in particular, was prized in the Norse world, not just for its culinary uses, but for its supposed medicinal powers. It was used to flavor stews, teas, and even early liquors. Vikings believed it could ward off disease, soothe coughs, and protect against spirits. Quirky fringe sources even suggest angelica was fed to cows to produce healthier milk. Whether that worked is lost to time, and likely to bovine indifference. You rub a brittle thyme leaf between your fingers. The scent rises quickly, peppery, sharp. These herbs would have been grown in small kitchen gardens near the longhouse, or gathered from the wild with a basket and a sharp eye. Some households kept apothecary scrolls, usually oral, passed down through generations, listing the uses of each plant, from headache relief to cough syrups made from boiled pine bark. Today's pharmaceuticals owe more than a little to these earthy beginnings. Near the base of the herb rack is something that looks like a hardened puck. Upon closer inspection, it is beeswax, slightly sweet-smelling, faintly dusty, used for sealing jars, waterproofing fabric, or even crafting makeshift candles when tallow ran low. A hard-working Viking housewife or servant might mix it with oil and pitch to make a sort of pre-modern cling film. Bees were kept when possible, but more often honey, and the wax that came with it was traded. This pantry likely holds months' worth of bartered effort, gathered one sticky jar at a time. You crouch down and find a stack of flat, slate-colored rounds in a low basket, dried seaweed. Not exactly a staple, but not rare either, especially near the coastlines. High in minerals, easy to dry, and probably awful if prepared carelessly. It was sometimes added to stews or used to wrap food before cooking on stones. There is an anecdote in one saga of a thrall who made himself sick on seaweed, claiming it was more trustworthy than his master's cooking. The master disagreed, strongly. Behind the seaweed, a small clay pot with a soot-black lid. You open it slowly, half expecting something sinister. Inside is a thick, viscous sludge with a pungent aroma. Fermented fish sauce, something like Roman garum, but born of colder waters and more stubborn fish. It was made by layering fish guts, salt, and herbs in a barrel and letting nature take its slow, fetid course. The result was a savory, tangy liquid used for seasoning or preserving. According to some scholars, this sauce had a role in social hierarchy. Who got to eat it, and how much, was not just about taste, but about status. It is, essentially, ancient Viking ketchup, if ketchup could threaten your sinuses. To your left is a shallow wooden bin of root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and what might be rutabagas, although no one can ever really tell. These hardy crops were buried in straw, stored in pits, or laid near the fire to keep the cold from spoiling them. They were sliced into stews, roasted in embers, or eaten raw, when there was truly no better option. Nutritionally, they carried families through the darkest months. Emotionally, well, let us just say rutabaga is not known for its charisma. There is a hand-carved ladle sticking out of another bin. You lift it and give the contents a stir. Dried peas and beans rattle like coins. Legumes were essential, easy to grow, easy to store, and easy to cook if you had several hours and no urgent plans. Viking porridge often included split peas, barley, and herbs, cooked until it reached the consistency of cement with a hint of optimism. Modern reconstructions suggest it was filling, though probably not thrilling. But then again, thrill is not what you are looking for in a pantry designed to outlast an ice storm. A small wooden frame sits nearby, holding what appears to be jerky, made from reindeer or elk. It is dark, dense, and incredibly tough. This would have been hunted rather than farmed, and the meat prepared on the same day, then dried over low heat or smoked over open fires. If you are lucky, it still contains traces of the animal's last meal, mossy undertones, and piney finish. The Norse were deeply tied. You move further along the pantry's curved perimeter, and your fingers brush against the cool wood of a large barrel. A faint dusting of flour clings to the top, suggesting recent use. You slide the lid open slowly, and a soft whoosh escapes as the scent of grain rises to meet you. Barley. Not just any barley, but the coarse, unrefined kind, speckled with husks and the occasional stone that no one bothered to sift out. This was not the soft, bakery-grade flour of your modern world. This was survival in a wooden bucket. Barley, along with rye and oats, was one of the core grains in a Viking diet. While wheat existed, it was expensive and difficult to grow in the northern climates. Barley, by contrast, was a workhorse, hardy, quick to mature, and versatile. It could be ground into flour, boiled into gruel, or fermented into ale. In this particular longhouse, it likely did all three. One crop, many purposes. That is the kind of multitasking any overworked Norse matron would appreciate. You lift a wooden scoop resting on the side of the barrel. Its handle is darkened from decades of use, the grain worn smooth where countless hands have gripped it in the same rhythm. With a gentle scrape, you push through the barley, hearing the soft cascade of grains shifting and falling like sand in an hourglass. Somewhere nearby is a second barrel, smaller, lighter, and clearly older. This one contains oats, the more temperamental cousin in the Norse grain family. Oats were less popular in some regions, mainly due to their need for richer soil, but where they thrived, they were loved, especially in porridge, a thick, gloopy porridge cooked over a fire until it bubbled like a bog in a saga. You imagine sitting by that hearth, trying to guess whether the smell was the oats or the cook's last pair of socks drying too close to the flames. Either way, you would eat it. Hunger is persuasive. Tucked beside the oat barrel is a linen sack tied at the top with twisted flax cord. You untie it slowly and dip your hand in. The contents are coarse and sandy to the touch. Rye flour, darker and grainier than anything you would find in a modern bakery. It would have been mixed with sour milk or whey, rolled flat, and cooked on hot stones or a griddle. The resulting bread was dense enough to double as insulation, and probably did more than once. In some regions, loaves were even baked with hollow centers, so they could be stacked on poles and left to dry over months. Historians still argue whether these grain loaves were used like modern crackers, or simply gnawed at like an edible building material. In one archaeological find, a chunk of bread was discovered fused into a roof beam. possibly storage, possibly structural accident, possibly both. The lines blur quickly in a pantry like this. On a lower shelf, almost hidden behind a wicker basket, you find a set of flat wooden trays. You pull one free and stare at the contents. Seeds, small, round, and glossy. Flax, they shimmer faintly under the oil in their skeins, and when you pinch one, it pops slightly, leaving a faint scent like green nuts and dust. But the seeds were eaten too. They were believed to aid digestion, which is a polite way of saying they kept things moving in an era when fiber was not optional, but mandatory. A folded cloth nearby contains another kind of seed. Hemp. Vikings used hemp for rope, clothing, and sometimes even for fishing nets. Whether they consumed the seeds is still debated. Some scholars suggest hemp seeds were ground into flour during famines, while others believe they were traded or discarded. You imagine a Viking looking at a handful of hemp seeds and saying, "This is for the boat, not the bowl," before tossing them into a net. You stand now before a three-legged stool that seems oddly out of place in the pantry, until you realize its purpose. It is for grinding. Set beside it is a handcorn, a simple rotary millstone used to grind grain by hand. Two circular stones, the upper one with a handle and the lower fixed in place. You give it a tentative spin. The top stone lurches, then rolls smoothly, grinding nothing but air. But you can imagine the sound when in use. A low, gritty rhythm, punctuated by the occasional curse when fingers strayed too close. Grinding flour was a task shared across the household, often given to thralls or children. It was slow, repetitive, and physically demanding, yet it formed the backbone of daily life. Without ground grain, there was no bread, no porridge, no ale, just cold roots and regret. Behind the corn, in a small bin built into the pantry wall, are the remnants of dried yeast cultures. Pale and crusty, they look like the corner of a forgotten scone, but they are precious. These were the sourdough starters of the Viking world, passed down from baker to baker, kept alive with careful feeding and the occasional whispered prayer. Some households named them, others buried them when they died, like fallen pets or disgraced warriors. Your eyes catch on a simple carved board nailed into the far wall. Upon it, a series of notches, some horizontal, others vertical, form a pattern. This is a tally, a grain log, marking the comings and goings of barley and flour. It is a pantry diary, the quiet accounting of mouths fed and months endured. The floor below is dusted lightly with spilled grain. A few rat droppings confirm the pantry's popularity extends beyond its human users. Viking longhouses had cats, but not the elegant Freya variety. These were hard-working Mausers, semi-feral and extremely. You crouch lower, your hand now brushing the uneven dirt floor, still cool despite the heat clinging to the rafters above. In this section of the pantry, tucked beneath a shelf smeared with smoke stains and soot, you find the heart of Norse culinary confidence, or desperation, depending on your point of view. The preserved proteins, dried, smoked, salted, or simply buried and hoped for the best, these were the foods intended to last through long winters, late springs, or sudden famines. There is no refrigeration here, only ingenuity and stubbornness. Your eyes fall first on a length of smoked fish, hardened and dark, strung up by its gills, and left dangling like some shriveled ancestor watching over the pantry. Cod, most likely. It was abundant in the cold northern seas, and lent itself perfectly to drying. Once split open and laid in the salty breeze, it became stock fish, hard, light, and able to survive months without spoiling. You knock on it lightly. It responds with the hollow thud of a wooden spoon, a Viking delicacy, or a medieval chew toy. Depends on how long you soak it. Beside the fish hangs a chunk of cured pork belly, slick with grease and wrapped in cloth stained dark from smoke. Salting meat was a tedious and expensive process, often reserved for special animals or events. Salt, after all, was not easily obtained. Large saltworks did not exist in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. So much of it had to be imported or made through the slow boiling of seawater. Historians still argue whether salt was more often used for preservation or for ceremonial uses, especially considering how much of it was needed just to keep a single leg of pork from walking off on its own. In a low wooden crate, you find dried sausages, strung like garlands of edible rope. The casing is slick and rubbery, the insides dark with blood and grains. Blood sausage was not a rare item in the Norse pantry. In fact, nearly every part of the animal was used after slaughter. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. Even the bladder might find new life as a canteen, or an enemy's unfortunate balloon gift. Leaning in close, you catch the smell of old fat. Rancid, yes, but not inedible, at least not technically. You find a lump of what looks like yellow soap tucked into a clay bowl. Lard, rendered pig fat, used not just for cooking, but as a kind of edible glue, binding ingredients, or sealing off jars to keep air out. In some recipes, lard was mixed with ash or herbs to create early ointments. In others, it was just lunch. Nearby, a tightly lidded wooden tub offers a more intense discovery. Pickled fish, probably herring, packed in layers with dill, mustard seed, and something sharp, perhaps horseradish. The smell punches you squarely in the nose. Eyes watering slightly, you replace the lid. Preservation by fermentation was an art form, albeit one born from necessity. Cabbage, turnips, and even fish were pickled to delay spoilage and keep gut bacteria at least semi-friendly. Your fingers trace the edge of a small ceramic jar, its lid sealed with hardened beeswax. Cracking it gently, you peer inside and find a dark, gritty paste, possibly mustard, though in its raw, ground form, no vinegar, just crushed seeds, water, and enough bitterness to sober up a berserker. Mustard seeds have been found in Viking Age contexts, usually imported from more temperate regions. Their exact role is debated. Some claim they were medicinal. Others suggest they were mixed into food to mask less than fresh flavors. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere between culinary flourish and olfactory desperation. Wedged beneath a slanted plank, you spot a wooden bowl covered with an animal hide. You peel it back and reveal dried lung slices, flattened and slightly curled. These were once used as quick meals, often roasted directly over the fire. The Norse diet, while rooted in farming and fishing, was not shy about scavenging from the inside out. Organs, stomach linings, and anything vaguely chewable were considered fair game. In one obscure saga, a hero earns a nickname for being the fastest to clean a sheep's intestines. We will let you imagine what kind of party that must have been. Further along, nestled in straw, are two small ceramic pots. The first contains dried eggs, not powdered, nothing so modern, but eggs cracked into cloth and left to dry in the sun until leathery. The second holds a collection of dried fish roe. These little pebbles of protein were sometimes eaten as is, or rehydrated and used to thicken broths. They have the texture of regret and the taste of nutritional obligation. A peculiar stone basin holds what at first appears to be dust, but turns out to be crushed bone meal, used both in fertilizer and occasionally mixed with flour during times of famine. It gave bread a gritty, chalky texture and a taste not unlike damp limestone. When you cannot afford luxury, you eat whatever does not kill you immediately. One narrow cupboard, really just a gap between beams, holds a row of bundled herbs tied with twine: dill, lovage, nettle, and angelica. While many herbs served culinary functions, others were strictly medicinal. Lovage was believed to ease digestion. Angelica, meanwhile, was practically a Viking multivitamin, used for everything from colds to scurvy prevention. Whether it worked or not is debatable, but chewing on angelica root certainly gave the impression you were doing something about your problems, which is half the battle. Resting near the bottom of a shelf, you find something that looks utterly out of place: a small wooden idol with exaggerated features and a deep frown. It is carved from driftwood and stained with soot. This may have been a pantry charm, part protective talisman, part passive-aggressive kitchen god. While there is little direct evidence of these objects being placed in food storage, you step carefully around a warped barrel and move into a smaller alcove tucked behind a support beam that leans like it is reconsidering its life choices. Not gleaming glass bottles or pristine wedges of cheddar, but a messier, older affair. Clay pots sealed with hide, wooden troughs crusted in dried curds, and a faint, sour smell that somehow reminds you both of comfort and mildew. Dairy in a Viking household was not a refrigerated convenience, but a living, fermenting gamble. You crouch by a squat wooden churn, its lid damp and slightly warped. The handle protruding from the top is smooth from years of use. This is where butter happens, or, more accurately, where you sweat in a rhythmic, up and down motion for what feels like an eternity, hoping that enough cream turns to solid before your arm gives out. Viking butter was not salted unless someone had access to that rare, crystalline miracle. More often, it was eaten fresh, soured slightly, or stored in lard to keep the insects and bad luck away. In Icelandic sagas, butter appears occasionally as a valuable item, sometimes gifted to travelers. One saga even tells of a man surviving a shipwreck by clinging to a keg of butter. It is not the most dramatic Norse survival tale, but it might be the. You lift the lid. Inside, the churn is empty now, save for a smear of yellow along the rim and a scent that is oddly familiar. Butter, gone slightly rancid, smells a little like forgotten socks and slightly like ambition. The Vikings may not have had a modern concept of pasteurization, but they understood what they needed to do to keep dairy from turning deadly, mostly by observing what did or did not kill their neighbors. To the left of the churn sits a series of low-slung shelves. On them are shallow bowls filled with what appears to be thick, white paste, curds, separated from their whey and left to mature. This would become skyr, a dairy product that still exists in Iceland today, though in Viking times it was tangier and less processed. Historians still argue whether the original skyr was more cheese or yogurt. The consistency is somewhere between the two, and its taste was enough to cause modern scholars to use phrases like challenging or acquired. Beside the skyr bowls is a peculiar sight, a woven basket lined with cheesecloth and heavy stones. Sometimes mold was scraped off, sometimes embraced. One Norse recipe reportedly included ash as a curing agent. It added flavor and discouraged vermin, though presumably encouraged existential questions during dinner. You reach toward a sealed jar set deeper in the shadows, your fingertips brushing its beeswax cap. Beneath it is sour milk, perhaps a week old. A spoon dipped in wood reveals something thick, yellowed, and flecked with solid islands. This is clabber, the natural result of leaving milk out in a warm place and hoping for the best. Not quite yogurt, not quite a science experiment. Clabber could be eaten, used in baking, or applied to wounds. According to some early medicinal texts, clabber helped heal cuts, burns, and pride. Near the jar, you spot a handful of carved bone tools, small spoons, a straining paddle, and something shaped suspiciously like a butter stamp. The stamps were sometimes used to press designs onto pats of butter before they were served or traded. Viking households were not above a bit of presentation flair. Nothing says rustic hospitality like offering a guest a curl of sour butter shaped like a stylized raven. At your feet is a clay vessel covered with a thin slab of wood. Removing the top releases a pungent smell. It is rennet, extracted from the stomach of a calf, used to curdle milk during cheesemaking. It smells like biology's way of keeping you humble. The use of rennet dates back thousands of years, and while the exact methods may vary, the concept remains the same. Harness the enzymes that break things down and repurpose them to build a snack. The presence of animal-derived rennet in Viking dairy raises a few eyebrows. Some suggest plant-based coagulants may have also been used, made from thistle or fig sap, or if that was a luxury for better-connected farmsteads. Above your head hangs a series of leather skins tied at the top. You reach up and squeeze one. It is soft and yielding, half full of liquid milk. Skins were used as portable containers, particularly useful for sending dairy from farm to market, or for bringing extra supplies to a feast. It is difficult to determine exactly how long milk remained safe in such conditions, though based on literary references, the answer may be not long enough. A cluster of beeswax-wrapped bundles lines the edge of the shelf, their contents bulging slightly at the sides. Inside are wrapped portions of soft cheese, likely flavored with herbs. Dill, angelica, and mustard seed were all used in Norse cooking to vary otherwise bland fare. Occasionally, dried berries or even ground nuts were added. The result was a cheese wheel with ambition, occasionally delicious, occasionally a cautionary tale. Toward the rear of the dairy alcove is a strange item. A small iron tripod with a shallow copper pan atop it. A forgotten tool, but still whispering of meals past. You lean back slightly, your head brushing a dangling sprig of dried thyme hung to repel insects. This corner of the pantry, though pungent and unpredictable, holds a kind of wild comfort. In every pot and bowl is a reminder that life in the Viking world was sustained not only by battle and plunder, but also by the relentless transformation of simple ingredients. Milk, churned and curdled, is not glamorous, but it is survival made tangible. You step away, the scent of curd and butter trailing behind you, and the faint crunch of old whey dust beneath your boots. You ease past a shelf where a shallow bowl of whey glistens, slightly translucent in the pantry's filtered light, and step into the corner that hums with dried fragrances and brittle quiet. It is warmer here, dry and crowded. Bundles hang from low rafters, tied with twine or wrapped loosely in linen, tangled bouquets of herbs, pale roots bundled like sleepy claws, and old pottery packed with spice remnants that make your nose twitch just by looking. This, it seems, is the pantry's apothecary, its spice rack, its semi-magical half-larder, half-pharmacy, where cooking meets something vaguely alchemical. Your fingers reach for a cluster of dried dill, its fronds feathered and almost gray now, but still pungent. Dill was a staple among Viking herbs, not merely for seasoning fish or dairy, but for its alleged calming properties. Mothers brewed it into weak teas for colicky children. Warriors stuffed it into their boots to reduce foot rot, or perhaps just to make their feet smell slightly more like pickled herring than death. Beneath the herbs lie wooden bowls filled with dried berries, bilberries, cloudberries, and crowberries. Some are shriveled and dark as charcoal, others stained amber or dusty purple. These were not only food but medicine. A handful could sweeten porridge or relieve an upset stomach. One saga tells of a woman who survived illness through nothing but mashed cloudberries and rage. Historians still argue whether Viking women had formal knowledge of herbal healing, or whether it was learned by rote and desperation, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter like secrets muttered into soup. A bit farther on, you stop before a low shelf stacked with carved boxes. You open one carefully. Inside, mustard seed, tiny, round, and surprisingly fragrant. The Vikings did not have access to most exotic spices known to southern Europe or Asia, but mustard, horseradish, and wild garlic were common enough to stir into sauces or grind into pastes. The boxes themselves are as much a marvel as their contents, made from birch bark, stitched with gut cord, then sealed with pitch or resin to keep out moisture and rodents, with a strong work ethic. Next to the mustard is a tiny sack sealed with waxed twine. You loosen it and sniff. Angelica root, sweet, earthy, and vaguely medicinal. Angelica was something of a panacea. People chewed it to ward off plague, carried it as a charm against evil spirits, and tossed it into stew just in case the stew was cursed. Its uses were as practical as they were superstitious. One 9th century manuscript from continental Europe even describes angelica as an herb of divine favor. The Norse, being practical folk with a flair for drama, naturally included it in nearly everything. You notice something strange now, a long, thin tool tucked behind the bundles. A mortar and pestle carved from soapstone. The bowl still bears green stains from dried herbs ground into fine powder. This was the Viking version of a spice grinder, and yes, it took a bit more effort than pushing a button. Imagine kneeling by the hearth, turning coriander into dust for a fish rub while hoping your neighbors are not about to burn your longhouse down because you borrowed their sheep. Tucked beside the mortar is a flask made of horn, stoppered with what appears to be beeswax. You pop it open and immediately regret it. The liquid inside is a sharp, vinegary concoction, herb vinegar, probably made by steeping garlic, sage, and whatever else was lying around in barley vinegar or soured ale. It was used both as a seasoning and as a wound wash. The scent is eye-watering, as though mustard and rot had a baby, but it was reportedly effective at cleaning cuts or discouraging lice, sometimes both. Above your head, bundles of thyme, yarrow, and tansy dangle like shriveled bats. These herbs, carefully dried and hung from the rafters, served multiple purposes. Thyme kept flies away and added savory notes to mutton. Yarrow was used to stop bleeding. Tansy, when boiled into a tea, helped with digestion, unless it helped with death, depending on dosage. Scholars still debate whether Viking apothecaries genuinely knew how to balance these potent plants, or if the pantry was less medicine cabinet and more wild roulette. You lean into the far corner, where a pile of dried seaweed curls, like abandoned ribbon. Seaweed was used as both seasoning and livestock feed. It provided iodine and salt, especially in coastal regions. Some even chewed it as a snack, which might sound odd until you remember modern people pay good money for kale chips. A final curiosity catches your attention. A dark glass bottle, unusual for the setting. You uncork it carefully and detect the unmistakable scent of garlic oil, sharp, warm, with that subtle funk of something kept too long. It was likely infused with herbs and stored to use in poultices or ointments. The Vikings believed in drawing out disease through the skin, and garlic, with its antimicrobial properties, often played the lead role in this pungent theater. The air here is heavy with scent, layers of floral, acidic, and earthy aromas fighting for dominance. You sneeze twice, then settle back on your heels. This section of the pantry is perhaps the least glamorous, but also the most human. It tells you that survival was not just a matter of calories, but of flavor, healing, and the belief, however scientific or superstitious, that nature held something useful in every root, sprig, and seed. You brush past a hanging bunch of sage and emerge with your nose twitching, your fingers slightly sticky with resin from one of the bark boxes. This was not merely a pantry, but a medicine chest, a spice cupboard, and a low-tech chemistry lab, a place where healing could smell suspiciously like salad dressing. You step from the tangle of hanging herbs and vinegar jars into an area of the pantry that feels somehow more sacred, or at least better hidden from casual guests, the shelf of preserved luxuries. Not everyday essentials, like dried fish or goat cheese, but the things you save for feasts, bribes, or impressive funerals. Even Vikings, for all their reputation for bluntness, had a flair for presentation. The first thing you spot is a squat clay jar sealed with a plug of linen and wax. You pry it open and lean in. The scent hits you, a thick, yeasty sweetness clinging to your nose. Honey, or more accurately, mead in the making. Honey was a rare and precious thing, harvested with considerable effort from wild hives or cultivated in simple skeps when available. A pantry with honey meant the household had resources, or a dangerously confident beekeeper. Historians still argue whether Norse apiary techniques were widespread or remained the domain of certain regions. But honey clearly played an essential part in Norse life, economically, ritually, and as an excuse to drink something other than water. Right next to it, dried apple slices, stacked like forgotten playing cards. These were usually sliced thin, threaded onto cords, and hung near the hearth to dry slowly. Apples, while not native to the colder extremes of Scandinavia, grew in many Norse settlements and were stored with care. There is an old belief that the Norse associated apples with immortality, thanks to the goddess Icon, who guarded the golden apples of the gods. It is unclear whether that myth inspired apple preservation, or whether it simply gave philosophical weight to a solid winter snack. Below the apples is a carved wooden container filled with hazelnuts, smooth, round, and still dusted with their outer skins. Nuts were prized for their shelf life, but more so because they did not require elaborate preparation. Crack them open, and you have fat, protein, and something to chew, while pretending not to eavesdrop on the gossip in the hall. According to some accounts, nuts were even used in divination rituals. One odd bit of folklore suggests that placing 2 hazelnuts near the fire could predict romantic compatibility based on whether they burned together or popped apart. A pantry snack and a matchmaking system, multitasking at its finest. In the darker back shelf, you find a shallow basket of dried mushrooms. Not just the edible kind, but the interesting ones. Vikings gathered several varieties for cooking, including chanterelles and bollits, but they also stumbled into the realm of mild psychedelia. Fly agaric mushrooms, recognizable by their red caps and white spots, have been speculated, though not definitively proven, to play a role in Norse shamanic rituals. Scholars still debate whether these mushrooms were used to induce trance states in certain ceremonies, or whether their appearance in mythology is mostly metaphor. You gently set the basket down, perhaps a little more cautiously than necessary. Next to the mushrooms is a coarse cloth sack, heavy in your hands. You untie the top and peer inside. Dried peas, surprisingly glamorous for something so humble. Peas were one of the most important plant proteins available to Viking households and featured heavily in winter stews and thick porridges. Easy to grow, easy to store, and easy to forget about until February, when you are desperate enough to eat the same 3 things on rotation. There is even archaeological evidence of pea mash found in cooking pits from Norse sites in Ireland and Britain, proof that culinary monotony is truly a universal human experience. Another item of note, a chunk of dense, brownish cake wrapped in oiled cloth. You break off a bit and sniff. It smells faintly of dried fruit and grease. Possibly a type of barley flat cake made with rendered fat and berries. This was the Viking equivalent of a protein bar. It traveled well, kept indefinitely, and could sustain you through days of marching or sailing. Whether or not it tasted like anything more than regret is another matter entirely. On a higher shelf, nearly out of sight, sits a small amphor-shaped vessel sealed with wax. You tug the cork and recoil. Fermented fish sauce, a cousin to garum, the Roman seasoning. It was made by layering fish with salt and letting nature take its course. The result was a thick, potent liquid that added umami depth to bland food and an unmistakable stench to your belongings. Norse people may not have had refrigerators, but they certainly knew how to weaponize fermentation. A scrap of cloth in the corner catches your attention. Underneath, something soft and crumbly, a wheel of dried skyr. Not the fresh kind sold in modern supermarkets, but its ancient, shelf-stable ancestor, essentially a dehydrated yogurt, high in protein, faintly sour, and hard as a rock if not properly soaked. It was ideal for long journeys or periods of famine. Some sources suggest warriors carried bits of skyr in their belts, ready to rehydrate it in water or mead. Again, it is unclear whether this was practical wisdom or just another attempt to convince yourself that sour milk counts as lunch. At last, you find a truly odd relic, a lump of tree resin wrapped in flax, not meant for eating, but for chewing, a sort of ancient gum. It freshened breath, strengthened jaws, and kept people occupied during long, awkward silences. Birch tar was the most common type, and some samples have been recovered with tooth marks still visible. The Viking version of nervously chewing your pen cap during council meetings. Here, in the feast corner of the pantry, you are reminded that Norse life was not all hardship and salted gruel. There was sweetness, spice, ritual. You move deeper into the pantry, approaching the very back, where the light dims and the air turns cooler. Here, the final treasures of the Viking longhouse pantry rest. Those rarest of rarities, the stores reserved for special occasions or desperate times. Your footsteps soften on the packed earth floor, and the familiar scent of smoke and dried goods gives way to something more pungent, more mysterious. On a low shelf, you find a collection of small wooden boxes, each intricately carved, their lids sealed tight with pitch. Inside, you discover a handful of dried fish roe, carefully preserved. These were considered a delicacy, a prized snack for those who could afford the effort. Fishermen might trade a few handfuls to their families, but the wealthy reserved them for feasts or gifts. The texture is strangely satisfying, gritty, salty, with an almost smoky aftertaste. Historians still argue whether roe was primarily a foodstuff or had a symbolic function, representing fertility or the abundance of the sea. Nearby, in a ceramic pot with a chipped rim, you find an old batch of lingonberries preserved in honey. The tartness of the berries balances the sweetness of the honey, a flavor combination that would have delighted the palate during cold winters. Lingonberries grow wild across Scandinavia, and their preservation was essential to avoid starvation when the snow lay deep. There is an old tale that a Viking chieftain once mistook a pot of lingonberries for treasure, prompting a minor uprising when his men demanded a share. Whether true or not, it illustrates how precious such preserved foods could be. Beside the pot sits a bundle of dried seaweed tied with hemp twine. Seaweed was more than just a maritime oddity. It was an important source of vitamins and minerals, especially iodine, which prevented goiter and other health problems. The evidence is patchy, with some claiming it was mainly livestock fodder, while others see it as an early form of superfood. In the far corner, you spy a stack of woven baskets filled with preserved meat wrapped in birch bark. Unlike the usual salted or smoked fish, this is reindeer jerky, dried slowly over the fire to retain a surprising amount of tenderness. Reindeer were a vital part of Norse northern life, providing not just food but clothing and tools. Across from the jerky is a crude wooden box holding fragments of blue cheese. Viking cheesemaking was more complex than often imagined, and many varieties were stored carefully to develop the right balance of mold and flavor. This particular cheese has a sharp temps, a taste of the damp caves where it was aged. Cheese was one of the few dairy products that could be stored for long periods, making it invaluable during months without fresh milk. There remains scholarly debate about how widely cheese was consumed among the Vikings versus how much was traded or given as tribute. You spot a small earthenware jug, half buried in sawdust, to keep it cool. You lift the cork and inhale a sharp, sour scent, fermented fish oil. Not for the faint-hearted, this pungent substance was used sparingly as a seasoning or medicinal ingredient. Its production required patience and a certain disregard for social norms, as the smell could linger on clothes and breath for days. Interestingly, similar fermentation practices appear across Northern Europe, but historians argue about the exact methods and cultural significance within Norse society. On a narrow ledge above, you find several coils of dried blood sausage, tied tightly and hanging like twisted ropes. Blood sausage was a common way to use every part of a slaughtered animal, preventing waste. The preparation involved mixing blood with grains or barley seasoning and drying or smoking. Some archaeological finds suggest that blood sausages were sometimes buried with the dead, hinting at a ritual significance beyond mere sustenance. Lastly, you notice a small pile of salt crystals nestled in a wooden bowl. Salt was a precious commodity in the Viking world, often mined or traded from distant lands. Its presence here reveals that this longhouse was connected to larger trade networks. Salt preserved the essentials, cured meat and fish, and allowed Vikings to store food through harsh winters. However, historians still debate the accessibility of salt for ordinary Norse households, as it could be prohibitively expensive for the common farmer or fisherman. As you turn to leave, the pantry feels less like a storage room and more like a carefully curated museum of survival and celebration. Each jar, each basket, holds not just food but stories of trade and travel, of seasons, harsh and mild, of feasts, joyous, and funerals, somber. You can almost hear the voices from the longhouse hearth, sharing laughter and secrets while cracking open a rare honeyed cake or gnawing on a piece of dried jerky. The pantry is quiet now, but it is a repository of life lived at the edge of endurance and delight. This slow tour through the Viking longhouse pantry reveals the ordinary, the extraordinary, and the strange